A black teen was handcuffed until he passed out. Seconds later, the crew froze when his CEO, father, walked in. A black teen was handcuffed until he passed out. Thinking no one would intervene, he didn't realize the CEO, father, was minutes away, ready to turn the entire crew into witnesses of instant justice. The moment the teen collapsed, the cabin froze in shock. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority steps in. The aircraft cabin was already sealed, the doors shut with a muted thud and the hiss of the pressurization system beginning its slow work. From a moment Dr. Kerrison Vale stepped aboard Meridian Sky, Flight 902. Something in the air felt wrong, like stepping into a theater mid-performance, when everyone's expression is too rehearsed, too quiet. He didn't pause. He didn't ask for help. He simply walked. Kerrison's shoes clicked softly against the polished flooring of the jet bridge and then transitioned to the muffled carpet of the aircraft. He moved like a man used to walking into pressure and bending it around his will. Today, however, he didn't come as CEO of Valorn Systems or as a keynote speaker for a summit on executive behavioral systems. He came as a father. He had received the call less than an hour ago. Clipped, formal, too rehearsed. A gate supervisor had informed him that his son, 17-year-old Jalen Vale, had been detained for a behavioral disruption just before takeoff. The phrase alone was enough to stir warning bells in Kerrison's mind. His son, thoughtful and quiet by nature, didn't provoke trouble. He deconstructed it. Something was wrong, and the voice on the other end of that call had known it. As Kerrison entered the main cabin, the atmosphere confirmed his suspicion. The air was still, hushed in a way that wasn't natural for a boarding aircraft. Passengers avoided eye contact, and every motion felt compressed, like something had just happened and no one knew how to act. The usual pre-flight chatter was missing, no laughter, no jostling of overhead compartments. Just a silence that hung heavy over row numbers and luxury headrests. Kerrison's eyes scanned the first-class cabin methodically, absorbing every detail without appearing to linger. He noted the man in 1B staring too long at a spot across the aisle, the man in 2A pretending to read while glancing up every few seconds, and the unusually still flight attendant at the front galley, who stood with his hands clasped too tightly behind his back. And then he saw it, half-tucked under the seatbelt on seat 2C, gleaming faintly in the cabin light, was a pair of metal handcuffs. They hadn't been properly stored. That much was clear. They weren't in a case, weren't clipped to a belt, just lying there, as if someone had used them in haste and tried to hide the evidence as quickly as possible. Kerrison's jaw flexed, not in anger, but in calculation. He began moving forward, his body still and composed, but with the unmistakable gravity of someone who would not be stopped. As he reached the front row of first class, a male flight attendant stepped into the aisle. "I'm sorry, sir. The forward cabin is under ongoing assessment," the attendant said with a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes. Kerrison met his gaze without blinking. "Define ongoing assessment," he said quietly, his tone even. The attendant's smile twitched. "Just a routine safety review, sir. I assure you it's nothing to worry about." Kerrison's eyes flicked to the attendant's name tag. Tad Inhade. Young. Nervous. Not a liar, but someone used to following orders. "Who made the call to detain a passenger?" Kerrison asked. Taryn's mouth opened, then closed again. "I'm not sure I'm authorized to. Was it Officer Braden Torque?" Kerrison asked, voice still low. Taryn blinked in surprise. Kerrison stepped slightly to the side, eyes fixed now on the passenger in 2C. The boy had his head down, face turned slightly toward the window, a soft line of shadow obscuring half his face. But Kerrison would recognize that posture anywhere. The slumped shoulders, the curled fingers resting awkwardly against the seat cushion, and the bruising red marks circling the boy's wrists. "His son, Jalen," Kerrison said softly. The boy stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open with effort. Recognition lit in his dazed expression, followed by a flicker of hope that looked almost painful. "Dad!" Before Kerrison could respond, another figure emerged from the rear, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed beard and a visible badge clipped to his belt. Officer Braden Torque. He walked like someone who expected obedience. His expression was stern, the kind that had long since mistaken control for justice. He stopped short when he saw Harrison, his brow furrowing as if trying to place the face. "You'll need to return to your seat, sir," Braden said, voice clipped. "We have an ongoing situation." Harrison didn't move. "That situation," he said calmly, "involves my son." A few heads turned. Whispers flickered. Braden paused, his eyes narrowing. "That boy," Harrison continued, "was placed in restraints. I'd like to know why, and I'd like to know now." "Protocol," Braden replied instantly, too quickly. He was interfering with equipment. Harrison's voice stayed even. "What equipment?" "That confidential," Braden snapped. "Was there a security breach?" "No, a safety hazard." Braden hesitated. Harrison took a slow breath. His eyes, still locked on Braden's, were not angry. They were calculating, dissecting every word, every inconsistency. "What exactly did he interfere with, officer?" There was no answer. Only a tightening of Braden's jaw and a quick glance toward the front of the cabin, as though seeking backup that wouldn't come. Behind Harrison, a man in row 3 whispered, "That's the kid they restrained?" "No way," another murmured. "The CEO's son?" And the whispers began to spread like static, building pressure through the walls of the aircraft. Taryn Hale took an involuntary step back. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The power dynamic had flipped. Harrison wasn't asking anymore. He was hunting the truth, and everyone in the cabin knew it. He glanced once more at the abandoned handcuffs, then back to his son's bruised wrists. He sensed this flight was already a battlefield the moment he stepped on board. The sharp edge of the metal cuffs had already turned Jalen Vale's wrists a deep, mottled red. His hands hung limp at his sides, skin swelling against the unforgiving steel. His breathing was shallow, his head bowed low between his shoulders, hair clinging to the sweat along his temple. The cabin lights glared off the reflective buckles across his chest, too bright, too public. A single tremor ran through his spine as consciousness stirred, but the confusion clung harder. He blinked slowly. The world wasn't coming back all at once. It returned in pieces, a tinny voice arguing near the front galley, the distant ding of a seatbelt sign, the sickening pressure in his wrists. His vision was fogged, edged in gray. Somewhere in the haze, he registered someone saying he passed out, just a panic response. The words weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They felt procedural, like the closing line on a form. Jalen tried to move, but the cuffs bit harder. The pain cleared some of the fog, but brought another wave of humiliation in its place. He cried out. He remembered now. When the officer had pinned him near the lavatory, when the cuffs clicked too tight, when the pressure on his back made his lungs falter, he'd said something. He wasn't even sure what. Maybe just please. Across the aisle, a crew member muttered sharply. Kid should have known better than to resist. Jalen's jaw tensed. That word, resist, was a lie. He hadn't resisted. He had asked a question. A simple one. Why are you searching my bag? That's all it had taken. A calm voice. A curious question. And suddenly Braden Torque, the man with the dark uniform and an over-polished badge, had decided he was a threat. The accusation had come quick, tampering with equipment, and the grip on his shoulder had come quicker. Jalen hadn't even had time to protest. His words had been buried beneath the pressure of Braden's body, forcing him into the wall. Now, bound and aching, he sat slumped like evidence of a crime that had never occurred. A figure moved across the cabin. Jalen tensed again, reflexively. His eyes, still dazed, tracked the footsteps. Voices layered over one another. The air in the cabin was thick with avoidance. No one asked questions too loudly. No one dared to challenge Braden outright. Not yet, but someone had. Taryn Hale sat in the jump seat along the bulkhead, gripping his phone beneath a folded safety manual. His hands were clammy, and his heart thundered against the lining of his vest. He hadn't meant to record anything, but when he saw Braden shove the boy against the lavatory wall, when he heard the cuffs click too fast, too hard, his instincts had reacted. Now the footage sat encrypted on his device, time-stamped and quietly damning. Taryn looked up briefly. Jalen's eyes had opened. There was something haunted there, something too heavy for a 17-year-old to wear. Taryn knew Braden, knew the way he worked. Months ago, he'd watched Braden do something similar to a passenger who had simply refused to give up an aisle seat during a delay. That time, it hadn't escalated this far, but it had been close. Management swept it under with phrases like de-escalation error and passenger overreaction. Taryn had buried his own unease. But this wasn't some late passenger. This was a kid. And worse, for Braden, this was the son of a man Taryn had just seen board the aircraft minutes ago. A man whose face he recognized from a quarterly safety summit brochure. Dr. Cahizon Valley, CEO of Valorn Systems. A man who didn't just understand technology, he understood power, policy, and people. Taryn's throat went dry. Braden didn't know who he'd cuffed. The footsteps grew closer. Jalen stirred again, sensing motion even before the voice came. "You awake?" a male attendant whispered, crouching slightly. His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure which version of Jalen would respond. Jalen nodded faintly, flinching at the movement. His lips parted, but the words were slow to form. "I didn't do anything," he rasped, his voice brittle and cracked from lack of breath. "I know," the attendant said, not unkindly, but not decisively either. That was the truth of it. Everyone around him saw only a boy in cuffs. No one had seen the moment when authority turned abusive. No one, except maybe one. Across the aisle, Taryn's fingers tapped anxiously on the back of his phone, hidden beneath the manual. Braden was just a few seats away, facing forward with the posture of someone trying too hard to look unbothered. But Taryn knew the signs. Braden's shoulders were too still. His eyes, barely visible in the reflection of the window panel, darted every few seconds. He was nervous. Taryn's thumb hovered over the archive icon. One tap, and the footage would be uploaded to his secured work archive. Not just saved, protected, but if Braden saw him do it, he'd find a way to retaliate. Braden didn't forgive disobedience. He didn't forget either. Still, Taryn made a choice. Click. The file disappeared into the cloud. Beside him, Jalen shifted, trying to straighten his back despite the pain lancing down his arms. He didn't want to look weak. Not in front of these people. Not after everything. His heart pounded, his mouth dry, but his eyes stayed focused. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the doubt. He could see it in the faces around him. People wondering what he had done. Wondering if the officer was justified. Wondering if he had brought this on himself. He wanted to shout, to scream, to tear the cuffs off and demand someone look at him like he was human. Instead, he sat still. And then, footsteps again. But this time slower, more deliberate. He turned his head, pulse skipping. Whoever was walking toward him wasn't just another crew member checking in. There was something different in the pace, in the energy shifting across the cabin. Something silent, sharp, and focused. Jalen didn't know yet who it was, but something in his gut told him this wasn't routine anymore. He sat straighter, or tried to. His voice cracked as he whispered under his breath. "Please, someone believe me." The footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and as his blurry vision sharpened for the first time since the cuffs closed, Jalen saw a figure standing tall, calm, and terrifyingly composed. He never expected the person walking toward him would change the entire course of this flight. Officer Braden Torque stepped into the aisle with practiced authority, his boots clicking against the cabin floor as if to remind everyone who controlled the space. His posture was rigid, his chin high, and his eyes scanning the passengers with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The badge on his chest caught the cabin lights with each movement, amplifying the illusion of power. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he made the announcement. "The passenger in seat 2A will remain restrained until landing due to continued noncompliance," Braden declared, his tone clipped and final. But the weight of his words didn't land cleanly. A ripple moved through the first-class cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing between the officer and the slumped figure in row 2, a teenage boy, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His arms were pulled taut at his sides, wrists bound, the metal cuffs biting in his swollen skin. One man in row 3 raised his hand cautiously. "Excuse me," the passenger said, hesitating. Why is he barely conscious? That doesn't look like noncompliance. Braden turned his head slowly, lips tightening. The individual resisted a lawful search. He escalated the situation, and appropriate measures were taken, he replied coldly. But there was a tremor in his voice, a crack beneath the surface. He knew eyes were watching. He just didn't know whose. Only a few feet away, in the aisle beyond row 1, a tall man stood quietly, arms crossed. His presence did not demand attention, but commanded it anyway. Dr. Carrison Vale said nothing, but his gaze was sharp and unwavering. His expression held none of the panic of a parent, only the still, calculating weight of someone who had seen power misused before. And Braden, though he couldn't yet place why, felt it. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. Meanwhile, Taryn Hale, the youngest of the flight attendants, sat stiffly at his jump seat near the galley divider. His fingers moved with controlled urgency, tapping out a message on his phone. Check lavatory hatch cam. Timestamp 2:47. Send footage now. He hit send, locked the screen, and tucked the phone beneath a seat cushion. His heart raced, not because of the risk to himself, but because he had seen this play out before. A power imbalance, a teenager accused, and a uniform used as a shield rather than a promise. In the silence that followed Braden's response, another passenger, nervous, middle-aged, clutching a briefcase, spoke softly but clearly. I heard the kid say he couldn't breathe, he said. More than once. Braden's jaw tensed. That's not. He stopped himself. The lie hovered, unfinished. Instead, he turned to the man and narrowed his eyes. I suggest you don't insert yourself into a security matter, sir. But the tension had already shifted. Small, almost imperceptible cracks formed in the wall Braden had built around his version of events. The murmurs of doubt grew louder in the minds of the passengers, even if their lips remained sealed. And then Carrison took a step forward. He didn't speak. Not yet. But the motion was deliberate, smooth, and impossible to ignore. Braden's eyes met his, and something in his chest tightened. The man was tall, well-dressed, unassuming, but the way he stood, the calm behind his stare, struck Braden like a warning siren only he could hear. The confidence Braden carried began to falter, if only for a moment. The silence between them stretched thin. Is there a problem, sir? Braden asked, his voice quieter now, less commanding. Carrison did not respond. He simply continued to observe, his eyes moving from Braden to the restrained boy in row 2. And it was only then that Braden noticed the similarity. The angle of the jaw, the eyes, the bone structure. He looked back at the tall man, and something shifted in his gut. It couldn't be, could it? The silence was broken only by the low hum of the aircraft and the distant buzz of a call button pressed accidentally by a startled passenger. Braden wiped his brow, disguising the movement as a habitual gesture, but his hand came away damp. Behind him, Terrence's phone buzzed once, soft, discreet. The footage had arrived. He didn't pull out yet. He didn't need to. Braden's voice returned, forced and hollow. As I said, the situation is under control. But his posture betrayed him now, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting too often, breathing a fraction too fast. The role of enforcer no longer fit him so easily. And then Carrison took a final step forward, just enough for Braden to register the slight nod he gave, not a greeting, but of recognition. It was then that Braden truly looked at him, saw the quiet gravity in his eyes, and realized that this man was not just another passenger. This was someone who had come looking for answers, and he already knew the right questions to ask. For the first time today, Braden felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Dr. Carrison Vale stepped into full view. The air shifted, not because he raised his voice, nor because he demanded attention, but because something about the way he moved, controlled, deliberate calm, cut through the silence like a signal. The cabin, which moments ago was buzzing with unease and subdued chatter, turned still. The flight attendant nearest the cockpit stiffened unconsciously. Even Braden Torque, standing firm in the aisle with the false security of a uniform, blinked and took half a step back without realizing it. I'd like to know, Carrison said, his voice low but piercing, why my son was placed in restraints without lawful cause. The word son rang like a bell through the narrow corridor of first class. Heads turned. The few passengers who had overheard fragments now leaned slightly forward, eyes darting between the restrained teenager and the man whose presence had just shifted the balance of the room. Braden's eyes narrowed. "Sir, this is a matter of security protocol. I'm going to have to ask you to know." Kerrison cut in, soft but firm. "You're going to answer my question." Braden's throat tightened. He hadn't connected the dots. The resemblance was there, the same sharp eyes, same structure in the face, but he hadn't expected the boy's father to be this man. Not the man whose name appeared occasionally on confidential interagency briefings. Not the man who chaired 2 regulatory tech oversight panels and had personally advised multiple aviation ethics reform committees. Not Dr. Kerrison Vale. Kerrison's gaze didn't move from Braden. "You placed restraints on a minor. You claim non-compliance, but I've reviewed the logs. I've received footage from Gate 4, and I've spoken with someone on the ground. So, I'll ask again, under what precise conditions did you justify placing handcuffs on my son?" There was no elevation in tone, but the precision in Kerrison's language made the silence unbearable. The tension wasn't loud, it was surgical. Braden swallowed. He was interfering with equipment. "We're trained to act preemptively in these situations." "Preemptively?" Kerrison echoed. "So, he hadn't interfered yet. You anticipated interference and restrained him based on a projection." "That's not. What I mean is, he was acting suspiciously. When I questioned him, he became evasive, and so you restrained him. Without informing the captain, without logging the action in real time, and without ensuring a medical evaluation after he lost consciousness. Is that correct?" Braden looked around as if expecting backup, but the other attendants stayed frozen. Some glanced away. One quietly stepped backward. "I'm asking you to stop interfering," Braden snapped, raising his voice now. "If you keep disrupting the investigation, I'll have to remove you from the flight." Kerrison didn't blink. "You'll what?" It wasn't a threat. It was a question, and one Braden suddenly wished he hadn't invited. Kerrison didn't flinch. He simply waited, letting the officer stew in his own attempt at authority. From the row just behind the altercation, a trembling voice spoke up. "Sir, I have something you should see." It was Taryn Hale. His fingers shook slightly as he stood, phone in hand, knuckles pale from the pressure of holding it. His eyes darted to Braden, then to Kerrison, then back again. Fear made his breath shallow, but he stepped forward anyway. Braden's expression changed instantly, from anger to dread. Taryn held up the phone. "It's footage. I recorded it, just in case. From my seat." He didn't know I was watching. Kerrison turned his head, just slightly. "Show me." Taryn stepped closer. His thumb trembled as he tapped the screen, bringing the video into frame. The lighting flickered. A low-resolution timestamp blinked in the corner. Then came the image, Braden, in uniform, dragging Jalen back toward the lavatory. The sound was muffled, but the boy's cry was clear. "Please, I didn't do anything." The footage continued, showing Braden forcing Jalen against the wall. The restraint was swift, rough, far beyond protocol. There was no sign of resistance, just fear. Braden lunged. His hand reached for the phone like a reflex, but Kerrison's arm moved first. He didn't shove. He simply lifted a palm between Braden and the device, calm, surgical. The gesture stopped Braden cold. "I suggest," Kerrison said, quietly, "you keep your hands down." Braden froze. "You didn't mention that part in your report," Kerrison continued, still watching him, not the video. "You stated he attempted to interfere with electrical components near the lavatory. But the footage shows none of that. He was resisting. That's not the full context. That clip has been forwarded," Taryn cut in, voice stronger now, "to the crew archive. I uploaded it before I stood up." Braden's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't speak. Kerrison's eyes narrowed. "This plane is still in the air. But every minute we remain at altitude, more people will be reviewing what you just did. You may want to choose your next actions carefully." In the silence that followed, a dozen things shifted. Passengers now leaned forward, not in curiosity, but in understanding. The tide had turned. Jalen, still restrained, turned slightly toward the sound of his father's voice, and a flicker of something, recognition, relief, entered his eyes. The crew no longer shielded Braden with their silence. Garrison stepped beside his son and placed a hand on his shoulder, gently, firmly. Braden didn't move. He didn't need to hear anything more. The power he thought he held had evaporated. What replaced it was truth, laid bare in evidence and in witness. And that was the moment Garrison knew the truth was about to surface. Taryn Hale's hands trembled as he raised his phone, the screen glowing softly in the dimmed cabin light. He didn't tremble because of the man standing beside him, Dr. Garrison Vale, silent and composed, but because of the one across the aisle. Officer Braden Torque's eyes tracked every movement, sharp with suspicion and barely veiled hostility. Taryn's pulse thudded against his ribs like a drumline echoing through a battlefield. Still, he stepped forward, positioning himself close enough for Garrison to see the screen without obstruction. The flight hummed quietly, but the tension was louder than any engine. The video began to play. On screen, Braden's figure surged into view, his hand seizing Jalen by the collar outside the lavatory. There was no sign of resistance from the boy, only confusion, then pain. Braden's voice barked inaudible commands, but the footage needed no sound. It showed everything. How Jalen's wrists were yanked behind his back, the way Braden twisted his arm unnaturally, the brutal tightening of the cuffs. Jalen's body arched, his mouth open in a silent cry. Gasps echoed from a few nearby passengers leaning into the frame. The illusion shattered in seconds. They hadn't witnessed the full truth earlier. Now they did. Braden reacted instantly, lunging forward with a burst of motion, fingers outstretched, eyes locked on the phone. But Garrison moved first. With calm precision, his arm rose between them, palm flat, halting Braden mid-step like a gate descending in front of a reckless animal. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He merely stood there, unmoving, unshaken, and utterly unimpressed. "Why?" Garrison asked, his tone like cold metal. "Did you omit this part of the struggle from your report?" Braden froze. His mouth opened, grasping for an explanation, but only stammered fragments came out. It's out of context. You don't understand what happened before." Garrison didn't blink. "No," he said quietly. "I understand exactly what happened before. You initiated contact. You escalated it. And you falsified documentation to hide it." Braden's face flushed. His stance turned defensive. "This footage isn't authorized. It shouldn't have been recorded." Taryn, still holding the phone, found his voice. It was thin at first, but it steadied. "It's backed up. I forwarded it to a secure archive before I stood up." He looked at Garrison, not Braden. "Even if something happens to this device, it's already been preserved. The timestamp's intact." Braden's eyes narrowed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. That's a violation of crew policy. Recording staff without consent. The crew smirked, confident the restraints would silence the teen, unaware that every second, every motion, and every security measure had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate injustice. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Garrison cut in, sharp but calm. Policy doesn't override law, especially not when it involves the mistreatment of a minor. He tilted his head slightly. And this footage isn't just evidence, it's proof of motive. The air around them turned heavy. Several passengers murmured, their voices threading together like an awakening. One leaned toward another in row 3 and whispered, "That kid wasn't resisting. He was attacked." Braden took a step back. His authority, once inflated by fear and uniform, had begun to leak like air from a balloon. The myth of control was dissolving in front of witnesses. Garrison now turned toward his son. Jalen, still slouched slightly in his seat, eyes hazy, looked up as his father approached. Garrison crouched beside him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, fingers resting just above the red indentation where the cuffs had dug into his skin. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough, "You're safe now. I'm here." Braden stared at that gesture. For a moment, his posture faltered, because it wasn't just the evidence undoing him, It was the dignity of a father defending his son without rage, without violence, but with truth. That power was unfamiliar to Braden. It frightened him. Harrison stood again, slowly, keeping his body between Braden and Jalen. Taryn lowered the phone, exhaling for the first time in what felt like minutes. His hand still trembled, but it was from release now, not fear. Passengers watched it all unfold. Those who had once doubted, now quietly shifting in their seats. Perceptions were changing. The narrative they'd been told was unraveling. And Braden? He no longer moved, no longer spoke. Because this wasn't just a challenge to his report. It was the collapse of everything he thought would protect him. Braden finally understood he had provoked the wrong family. Jalen Vale's head rose slowly, the motion trembling as though it defied gravity itself. His breathing was shallow, but the steady tone of his father's voice worked like a tether, pulling him out of the fog. Harrison was already kneeling beside him, his presence commanding without urgency, fingers gently reaching for the pulse point along Jalen's wrist. The boy winced involuntarily as Harrison's thumb passed over the raw indentations left by the handcuffs. Harrison didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. His silence was sharper than any rebuke, his focus absolute. Braden Torque stood just a few paces behind them, his arms rigid at his sides, trying to decide whether to defend his actions or retreat before things escalated further. He watched the interaction unfold, unaware that every second of Harrison's quiet analysis was carving away the shield of lies he had constructed earlier. The boy wasn't acting. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't threatening. He was recovering from something, and the evidence of abuse wasn't just in his voice, but now visibly imprinted on his skin. Harrison's voice was low but exact. "Jalen, can you tell me what happened?" Jalen's lips parted, but the words stuck to the back of his throat. He forced a breath, blinked a few times, then whispered with a dry rasp. "I asked why he was searching my bag." The boy's gaze didn't waver. He didn't offer an excuse, only the truth in its simplest, clearest form. A beat passed, then another. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. It was quiet, but loud enough that Braden flinched. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The passengers were no longer neutral observers. They were becoming witnesses. Harrison turned toward Taryn Hale, the junior flight attendant who had already stepped into the fire once. "The timestamp on your recording. Does it match the time in Officer Torque's incident report?" Taryn, visibly tense but resolute, pulled up the footage again on his phone. His thumb scrolled, paused, tapped. "No, sir. There's almost a 12-minute discrepancy. His report says the altercation happened at 3:42. My recording starts at 3:54, but it captures the entire interaction from beginning to end." Harrison nodded once. "It was enough. Would you say your recording was unbroken?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Continuous. No edits." "And the incident report?" Taryn hesitated, glancing briefly at Braden, who shifted uneasily. "It claims Jalen resisted during a compliance check, but the footage shows he was standing still. Calm. He just asked a question." Harrison's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. A pattern was taking shape. Intentionnelle fabrication. Misuse of restraint protocol. False reporting. And most damning of all, prejudice masked his procedure. He stood up slowly, turning his head toward the flight deck. "Captain Talvek to cabin," he said calmly. "No shouting, just presence." The intercom clicked. Static buzzed faintly, then a voice replied, "Captain on his way." Seconds later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Roran Talvek stepped out, his uniform crisp and his demeanor sharp, but unprepared. His eyes scanned the cabin, settling first on Braden, then on the restrained teenager, and finally on Harrison. The confusion in his expression was genuine. "Someone explain what I'm walking into," Talvek said firmly, stepping forward. Harrison gestured slightly toward the phone in Taryn's hand. "A situation requiring escalation. Officer Braden Torque detained my son without cause. We have video evidence, witness statements, and discrepancies in official documentation. My son was denied breath, circulation, and basic dignity." The captain frowned. "Your son?" Harrison nodded. Jialing Valley, age 17. Boarded this aircraft alone. I received an alert moments before takeoff that he had been restrained. No justification was given. I boarded this flight immediately. Talvek turned to Braden. Is this true? You applied restraints. Braden cleared his throat. Captain, I followed protocol. The passenger was non-compliant. Kerrison tilted his head ever so slightly. Show him, Taryn. The phone screen lit up again, and Taryn held it toward the captain. The footage rolled. Braden forcing Jalen against the lavatory wall, twisting his arms with disproportionate force, cuffing him while he pleaded for breath. There was no sign of resistance. No aggression, only confusion and pain. Captain Talvek's face darkened. He watched the full clip without comment. When it ended, he looked at Braden, his voice cold. Why wasn't I notified of this immediately? Braden faltered. It was under control, Captain. No need to. You made a restraint decision on a minor without informing the pilot in command, the captain said, his tone rising just slightly above professional calm. And falsified the report timestamp. Braden opened his mouth again, but the words didn't come. Kerrison crossed his arms. Captain, I believe the Aviation Conduct Charter Section 14C requires you to report this to federal oversight within the hour. The captain nodded stiffly. It does. Braden tried once more, voice shrill now. Sir, with all due respect, you're taking a side before. I'm taking the side of documented truth, Talvek said, stepping between Braden and the father-son pair. And you'll explain the rest to the authorities when we land. Braden looked around, searching for backup, but the cabin had shifted entirely. Taryn's shoulders had straightened. Varric Donnell had moved quietly into the aisle, standing just a few feet behind. The passengers watched in tense silence, many already pulling out their phones, not to film, but to remember, to testify, to tell the story right if it ever needed to be told again. Braden's composure began to crack. His jaw clenched. His gaze darted toward the cockpit, then back to Kerrison, whose expression remained unreadable. And that was the moment the captain realized trust had been placed in the wrong man. Captain Roran Talvek stepped between Braden and the gathered passengers with the kind of presence that did not allow confusion to linger. His expression was stern, clipped with precision, as he barked, "Why wasn't I informed earlier?" The words fell like thunder in the already tense cabin. Braden Torque opened his mouth, but what came out was not an answer. It was a scramble. Sir, there was a situation with the passenger, and I followed protocol. Talvek's tone sharpened, cutting through Braden's excuse like a blade. I have passengers disturbed, a teenager injured, and a video circulating among crew. Don't give me fragments. Give me facts. Braden flinched slightly, caught off guard by the directness. For the first time, his voice shrank instead of booming. I was going to file a report after landing. I didn't want to escalate. The passengers shifted, murmurs building around them like rising static. Dramatic irony flickered across every face. They now understood that the chain of command, once firmly under Braden's grip, had shifted without ceremony. Talvek's eyes scanned the group until they settled on Kerrison Vale, who remained motionless but radiated focus. I'm requesting the restraints be removed immediately, Kerrison said, not loud, not angry, but with such authority that silence fell again. My son is not a threat. He never was. Braden hesitated. The handcuffs had become more than a restraint. They were the last thread of control he still held. To remove them now meant surrender, admission, defeat. But Talvek didn't wait for a reply. Remove them, he ordered, this time louder, more forceful. Now! Braden moved, slowly, hesitantly. His steps toward Jalen were unsteady, his hands trembling, not with compassion, but the kind of fear that coils in a man's stomach when the balance of power dissolves. He reached for the cuffs. Click, click. The metal unlatched, leaving behind angry red marks on Jalen's wrists, rings of pain that whispered the truth louder than any argument. Several male passengers, previously silent, clenched their fists or narrowed their eyes, empathy twisting their expressions. Jalen didn't speak. He only glanced at his father, eyes glassy but present. Kerrison stepped in instinctively, hand on his son's back, guiding him gently. He didn't need to say a word. His presence did the speaking. Braden, meanwhile, stood awkwardly, unsure where to place himself, suddenly very aware of every breath he took. Talvek turned to Taryn Hale. "Is that the only recording?" Taryn blinked, startled by the direct address, but nodded slowly. "There's more. The lavatory hatch camera, it caught different angles. Probably the whole thing." The air thickened with a new kind of tension, one built on irreversible evidence. Braden's eyes widened. "That footage is confidential," he barked, grasping for relevance. "Only when used appropriately," the captain snapped. Which, from what I've seen so far, it wasn't. Then another voice entered the conversation, quiet but firm. "Sir," said Varick Donnell, a younger flight attendant whose nerves made his voice wobble. I saw Braden cuff the kid. Too tight. I didn't say anything earlier. I was afraid." The room froze for a moment. Braden's mouth twitched. "You weren't even near the lavatory. You're lying to save yourself." But no one moved to support him. No glances of solidarity came from the crew. His island of control had fully eroded. Talvek turned to him sharply. "Enough. One more baseless denial, and I'll have you relocated to observation now." Braden, perhaps for the first time, saw the full picture. He stood like a man surrounded by fire, heat licking at his collar. No exit in sight. But he made one last attempt, voice low but firm. "Upon landing, I will request ground security. We'll let proper authority sort this out." Talvek's brow lifted. "You think this isn't proper authority?" Braden said nothing. Kerrison didn't look at him. He looked only at his son. Jalen, still trembling faintly, leaned into his father's side, allowing himself to rest his head for just a moment. It was a gesture not of weakness, but of anchoring. A father's hand found its place on his shoulder. The cabin, full of strangers, was now a witness to a reversal they hadn't expected. Authority no longer belonged to uniform, but to truth. And that truth stood on one side of the aisle, wounded but upright. And that was when Braden realized he had lost both control and the narrative. "Captain, I'd like a word off the aisle." The voice was low but resolute. Captain Roran Talvek had barely finished scanning the crowd when Kerrison Vale's quiet command reached him. There was no escalation, no hostility, only the unmistakable tone of a man used to giving strategic directives. Talvek nodded, gesturing toward a space beside the galley wall near the front of the cabin. Kerrison guided his son gently beside him, keeping Jalen within arm's reach. The boy was still pale, one sleeve rolled up to reveal wrist bruises that had turned a shade darker since the cuffs were removed. Talvek paused, eyes flicking between Kerrison and Jalen. "I understand the urgency, sir, but protocol requires that we consider." Kerrison cut in, politely but firmly. "I'll hear your protocol, but I won't be letting my son out of arm's reach until this flight lands and he's placed under medical supervision." Talvek inclined his head in agreement. The narrow space near the galley offered a moment's reprieve from the eyes of the cabin, but not from the tension thick in the air. Crew members stood at stiff attention, watching Kerrison with newfound deference, while Braden Torque remained seated several rows back, fuming in silence, mistaking stillness for control. "We've reviewed the immediate facts," Talvek began. "Given the nature of the restraint, the video evidence provided, and the condition of the minor, I have authority to initiate an emergency diversion to the nearest qualified airport." Kerrison studied him with an intensity that never once turned aggressive. "That won't be necessary," he said, voice steady. "I request we proceed to our intended destination." Talvek hesitated. "Sir, the standard operating procedure." "Captain," Kerrison interrupted softly, "our destination airport houses federal aviation regulators this very hour. I'm scheduled to keynote the summit they're attending. An unscheduled landing will only delay formal accountability. I want this addressed where oversight is immediate and where officials are prepared." The logic hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Talvek blinked. Braden, overhearing from a distance, paled. The captain took a breath, glancing toward the rear. "He doesn't know," Kerrison added, his tone devoid of malice. "He thinks this can still be managed with a few radio calls." but I reported the incident before I boarded. 3 aviation ethics officers have already acknowledged receipt. Outside the galley partition, murmurs stirred through the passengers. News was traveling fast, bouncing from row to row like static. The balance of perception was shifting. The man once presumed to be a quiet father now stood revealed as a figure of institutional power and strategic patience. Braden shifted uneasily in his seat. He pulled his device from his vest and tapped the screen quickly, eyes darting. Still trying to signal someone he believed could intervene. Still clinging to a ladder that had already been kicked away from beneath him. Back at the galley, Talvek exhaled slowly. I'll make a statement. Secure the flight environment. Alert the tower that will be arriving as planned, with a full misconduct file to be reviewed on ground. Kerrison gave a single nod of approval. Thank you, Captain. That's the correct call. Before they could part ways, a voice cut in, nervous, young, but gathering strength. Captain, sir, I have more. Taryn Hale stepped forward, his hand extended with another device. I made backup copies of all incident footage to the airline's secure cloud node. Time-stamped, synchronized, unalterable. Talvek's eyebrows rose. You acted before stepping forward? Taryn nodded. I saw what he did. I've seen him do it before, months ago. But this time it wasn't just a passenger. It was a child. I wasn't going to stay silent again. Behind him, another crew member hesitated, then stepped forward. I'll have my account, Varric Donnell said quietly. I saw the restraints go on. He didn't resist. Talvek's face hardened, not in hostility, but in clarity. Thank you both. Your honesty is noted. Kerrison gave a subtle glance toward Braden's seat. The man now sat stiffly, eyes blank, shoulders clenched. Not a word escaped him, but his mind was clearly racing through countermeasures that no longer existed. In his world, the truth had always been pliable. Today it had become concrete. Captain, Kerrison said, I assume your crew manifest includes data timestamps for internal movement between cabin zones? It does, Talvek replied. Good, Kerrison said. It'll match the timestamps on Taryn's footage, in conflict with Officer Torque's written report. Talvek didn't need further prompting. The alignment of evidence was becoming too clean, too precise. This wasn't going to be a case of internal mediation. It would be tribunal-level oversight. Maybe higher. Taryn added, voice steadier now. Passengers saw it too. Row 4, row 6, some were watching when Braden shouted. They'll testify. Even from where they stood, they could feel the shift. Heads were turning. Passengers were no longer passive. They weren't afraid, they were aware. The silence in the cabin wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was observation, witnessing, processing, aligning. Talvek's voice dropped to a whisper. He's not going to walk away from this, is he? Kerrison's expression didn't change. He might walk, but it won't be out of this airport, and it won't be without consequence. They returned to the aisle as one. Jalen leaned slightly against the wall, still regaining color in his cheeks. Kerrison placed a firm hand on his shoulder and kept it there. Braden rose halfway from his seat, as if ready to interrupt. But no one called on him. No one invited his defense. Talvek turned back toward the cockpit, already preparing the cabin-wide directive. He would formalize the situation in a way the aviation community had never quite seen before. Kerrison waited, eyes steady, heart hammering beneath the stillness. For all his tactical calm, the sight of his son's bruises still lived beneath his skin like fire. Braden stepped back, slumping into his seat once again, not from exhaustion, but because standing no longer offered advantage. The eyes of the crew, the silence of the captain, the knowledge in Kerrison's gaze, it had all stripped him of the power he once held through intimidation. And as the final pieces aligned, with truth moving freely through cabin whispers and archival nodes alike, Kerrison stood unmoved, unmoving, and unshakable. And for the first time, Braden felt the walls closing in with no path to escape. All passengers, please remain seated. We are currently undergoing a conduct review in progress. The captain's voice, steady but firm, felt like a quiet gavel through the cabin. The phrase, conduct review in progress, was unfamiliar, alien even to the most seasoned travelers. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A hush rolled through the rows like a slow wave, extinguishing even the murmurs. Braden Torque stiffened. He had heard that phrase before, only once during an incident briefing years ago. It was language reserved for high-level disciplinary actions, not standard protocol, not something invoked lightly, and certainly not something meant to be broadcast over the intercom. From seat 2A, Jalen stirred, his breath shallow but more controlled, his face pale and drawn. Harrison Vale shifted beside him, lifting a firm hand to steady his son's shoulder, gently helping him recline with more support. He didn't say a word, but the passengers could read everything in the movement: care, authority, and a calm resolve. Across the aisle, Braden watched them. His knuckles whitened on the headrest he gripped. The once commanding lines of his uniform now seemed less crisp, his stance less sure. The power he had wielded minutes ago was unraveling before his eyes. Harrison turned, scanning the cabin with sharp calm before addressing the captain, who had exited the cockpit and stepped forward to observe firsthand. "My son just remembered something," Harrison said, his voice low but unwavering. Before he was restrained, he heard a phrase. Jalen nodded weakly, then rasped out the words, each syllable faint but deliberate. He said, "Should have stayed quiet." Several passengers turned visibly, their expressions shifting. It was no longer just about procedure, it was about motive. Captain Talvek's face tightened. "Jalen," he said gently, kneeling to his level, "are you certain?" The boy nodded. "He said it. Right before he grabbed me." Braden erupted. "That's a lie. He's saying that now, just to protect himself." Harrison turned slowly, one brow raised, not in anger, but in profound disbelief. Protect himself from what? Officer Torque? From a truth. The silence returned, thicker this time. Talvek stood, tapping his cockpit tablet. "Let's verify the security logs. I need timestamps of your crew system access." His fingers moved with trained efficiency, opening the digital records. Harrison watched every move. So did Taryn Hale, now standing near the beverage station, phone still in his pocket. Then the captain's face changed. His jaw tightened. His brows drew together. "Braden," he said without looking up, "you accessed the crew notes at 2:14 p.m. "Yes," Braden said too quickly. "That's when I was filing my report." "No." Talvek cut in, holding the screen higher. "That's before the incident, not after. Your report claims the incident occurred at 2:25 p.m. Braden froze. Foreshadowing hung thick in the air. Harrison folded his arms, his voice quiet. Unauthorized access. Fabricated timestamp. And now, a verbal threat witnessed by the victim. "Shall we keep going?" Braden's hands twitched. "I was reviewing earlier notes. Not accessing restricted data." "You clicked through a sealed incident folder labeled Crew Behavior Protocols," Talvek clarified. "That requires executive clearance, which you don't have." At that moment, Taryn Hale stepped forward. "Sir," he said to the captain, voice nervous but steady, "I'm ready to testify as well." Captain Talvek nodded slowly. "Go ahead." Taryn didn't glance at Braden, though he felt the man's stare burning. The officer's behavior wasn't just harsh, it was targeted. And earlier in the flight, I overheard him muttering about watching the kid closely. I didn't say anything because I didn't think it would go this far. I regret that. A few rows back, another voice joined in. Varick Donnell, the stocky attendant with a buzz cut, raised a hesitant hand. "I saw him apply the cuffs," he said. "They were too tight. I should have stopped him, but I didn't." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too far. Braden looked between them, breathing harder now. "You're lying," he barked. "You're just turning on me because he's what?" Harrison asked, stepping forward slightly. Braden's mouth opened, but no words came. Harrison leaned just enough that his voice, quiet as it was, carried across the stunned cabin. "Be very careful with your next sentence." Braden recoiled, his bravado flickering out like a candle in wind. The passengers exchanged looks. The pieces were aligning. The restrained teen, the panicked officer, the unearthed recordings, and now a motive, a sentence spoken in anger that betrayed everything Braden had claimed. "Captain," Carrison said, his voice now sharp with professional clarity, "you have motive, video evidence, verbal threats, a manipulated log, and multiple witnesses. There is nothing procedural about what happened to my son. This was targeted misconduct." Talvek nodded grimly, eyes still on Braden. "I'll log the phrase officially and flag it for conduct board review. This is no longer an internal issue." From behind them, a few men clenched their jaws. A ripple of shared anger, quiet but fierce. Braden's stance wavered again, and Braden understood the final blow had not yet been delivered. "Officer Braden Torque, you are hereby relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight," Captain Roran Talvek announced, his voice firm and publicly unshakable. The words struck like a seismic wave through the cabin, silencing even the quietest murmurs among the passengers. Every man in the aisle stiffened. Braden, standing just feet away from where Carrison knelt beside his son, froze. "You can't be serious," Braden scoffed, eyes darting around the cabin for support that wasn't there. "I acted within. If you refuse to comply," the captain cut in sharply, "this aircraft will be classified as a compromised environment. That will trigger an automatic elevation to military response protocol upon landing. Do you want that?" A thin bead of sweat slid down Braden's temple. He opened his mouth to argue, but said nothing. His authority had evaporated, not in a blaze of confrontation, but in the quiet, accumulating erosion of trust. He scanned the faces around him. None held sympathy, not one. Taryn Hale, who had stood quietly near the galley since presenting his footage, stepped forward at the captain's nod. The junior flight attendant's hands were tight at his sides, but his voice didn't shake when he said, "This way, officer." Each step Braden took down the aisle felt like a closing chapter. Taryn walked beside him with silent composure, the echo of their shoes across the cabin like a drumbeat of finality. Every passenger they passed turned slightly, eyes following the fallen man who had once strutted with impunity. Braden's spine remained stiff, but his shoulders sagged with each row. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Jalen Vale tried to sit up unaided, his hands braced weakly against the leather seat, arms trembling from the effort. He refused to appear weak, not in front of strangers, and especially not in front of the man who had handcuffed him. But before he could fully rise, Carrison Vale's hand touched his shoulder gently, anchoring him with a quiet firmness. "You've already proven your strength," Carrison said, his voice low and even. "Let your body heal. The fight is mine now." Jalen met his father's eyes and, for the first time since waking from near unconsciousness, allowed himself to exhale. The stillness was broken when a man in a charcoal blazer leaned forward from seat 3C. He cleared his throat, hesitant, then rose halfway and motioned discreetly to Carrison. "Sir, if I may?" Carrison turned his gaze, alert but neutral. The man stepped into the aisle, careful not to draw too much attention, and extended a business card between two fingers. "My name is Damon Karan. I'm a legal consultant. I'm en route to the summit you're scheduled to keynote." He glanced toward the rear, where Braden now sat with arms folded like a prisoner. "I witnessed everything from the moment the boy was restrained." Carrison studied him for a second, then accepted the card with a single nod. "I'm prepared to testify," Damon added. "On record, under oath." Before Carrison could reply, another man in row 4 raised his hand. He was older, his suit worn at the cuffs, but his tone was clear and decisive. "I heard that officer instruct an attendant earlier to watch that kid closely." Those were his words. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now." Carrison slowly turned back to Jalen. His son's face was pale but focused, listening to each voice that rose in defense of truth. Carrison's mind moved like clockwork, witnesses, statements, audio logs. He was already constructing the skeleton of what would become a decisive legal and procedural response. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its slow descent. Captain Talvek emerged from the cockpit once more, tablet in hand. He approached Kerrison with the gravity of a man who now understood the full scale of the storm they were flying into. "The destination airport has confirmed," he said quietly. "A Federal Aviation Review unit is already on the ground. They were there for the summit, but they're prepared to receive your report directly." Braden, seated at the back of the plane under Taryn's watch, heard those words and visibly recoiled. His fingers tightened around the edge of the seat, and for a moment it seemed as though the oxygen had left his lungs. The earlier bravado that had fueled his aggression was gone, replaced by the realization that his fate was no longer in his control. Kerrison didn't gloat. He simply nodded, folding the business card into his coat pocket. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been unease and fear, now there was a sense of inevitability. Justice had entered the cabin, not through force, but through clarity, courage, and the slow unraveling of deceit. Taryn returned from the rear and gave Kerrison a quiet nod, confirming Braden was secure. Then he handed Kerrison a printed statement, his formal testimony, signed and time-stamped. The noise of the engines deepened as the descent grew steeper. Kerrison tightened his grip on the seat armrest, not out of fear, but from the quiet anticipation of what waited beyond the runway. He leaned close to his son. "This isn't over, but you're not alone." And just then, he looked across the cabin at the passengers who had watched, listened, and remembered. He saw what Braden never had: people who were no longer afraid to speak. And the truth now moved toward justice with unstoppable momentum. The wheels struck the runway with a smooth, muted thud. Inside the cabin of Meridian Sky, Flight 902, no one moved. The seatbelt sign remained lit, but it wasn't the usual signal to wait. It was a command cloaked in protocol. A pause, tense and collective, settled over the passengers as the intercom crackled and Captain Talvek's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm but even, "we have landed at Valoran International. Please remain seated. Law enforcement and aviation integrity officers will board the aircraft first. Do not attempt to retrieve personal items or leave your seat until directed." Braden Torque's hands were slick with sweat. His shoulders, once squared with manufactured authority, now drooped under the weight of unraveling consequence. He sat halfway down the cabin in an aisle seat, flanked by two crew members who had not spoken to him since the captain's mid-air decision. His gaze darted from one side of the aircraft to the other, searching for something: control, an escape, a sympathetic face, but found only stiff postures and eyes that would no longer look at him directly. At the front of the first-class cabin, Kerrison Vale sat upright beside his son, Jalen. The boy's breathing was steadier now, but his wrists still bore angry red marks, the shape of metal engraved into soft skin. Kerrison had wrapped one of the blankets around Jalen's shoulders, a small act of care that contrasted sharply with the cold brutality inflicted upon him earlier. His mind was already building, step by step, the framework of the legal, corporate, and federal escalation that would follow. He turned slightly as Taryn Hale approached again, his phone in hand. "I didn't include this earlier," Taryn whispered, voice tense with nerves. "But there's one more clip. Audio only." Kerrison looked at him, and Taryn pressed play. The voice was unmistakably Braden's, rough, arrogant, low. "Kids like him need lessons." Kerrison's jaw didn't tighten. His expression didn't change. Instead, something behind his eyes cooled, like steel settling into form. "Thank you," Kerrison said quietly, the words simple, deliberate. "That honesty may be more important than you realize." The aircraft door unlocked with a pneumatic hiss, and the pressure in the cabin shifted. Two uniformed federal officers stepped aboard first. Male, tall, deliberate in their movements, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the cabin not for danger, but for details. A third man followed, aviation integrity liaison, his blazer marked with an agency crest stitched in blue and silver. They approached Kerrison first. "Dr. Vale," the lead officer asked, "we received your report and video package. We'd like a brief initial statement before full debriefing. We also have a medical team standing by for your son." Kerrison stood slowly. My son is here, he said, stepping aside slightly. The officers leaned down to address Jalen directly. One of them offered a gentle nod. You're safe now, son. Let's get you checked out. As they guided Jalen down the aisle, the attention of the entire cabin subtly shifted. The passengers, still frozen in their seats, tracked the moment like witnesses in a courtroom. Then came the second name. Braden Torque, the liaison officer announced, voice precise, emotionless. Please stand. Braden's face contorted, caught between disbelief and protest. But no words came. He rose slowly, wobbling on uncertain feet, his confidence utterly eroded. You are being detained pending investigation under Clause R7 of the Aviation Passenger Protection Code. The officer continued. Please do not resist. One of the crew members, Taryn, stepped slightly to the side as Braden was escorted forward, passing by the same rows he had strutted through just hours before. The silence was not awkward. It was monumental. As Braden walked by, one man in row 4 whispered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Another reached for his phone, not to film, but to make a note. This would be testimony. And Carrison stood by the front row, his back straight, hands calm at his sides, watching the process unfold with the gravity of someone who had seen injustice, confronted it, and now witnessed its long-delayed consequence. The last look Braden gave as he was led off the plane was not to the captain, not to the officers, and not even to Jalen. It was to Carrison, and the look he received in return was not one of vengeance. It was a certainty, and the entire cabin witnessed the fall of a man who thought no one would ever hold him accountable. The restraints clicked shut behind him. Braden Torque didn't say a word as federal officers led him down the corridor of Valor International's secure terminal, the same metal cuffs now cutting into his own wrist that had, hours earlier, bruised the skin of a 17-year-old boy. The irony wasn't lost on Carrison Vale, who watched from behind a sheet of security glass, his expression unreadable, carved in steel. Inside a private medical suite just beyond the gate, Jalen Vale sat on an examination table. A single pulse monitor beeped slowly beside him. His wrists were mottled with raw indentations, the flesh discolored where circulation had faltered. The attending physician, a male specialist dispatched by the airport's rapid response trauma unit, lowered his stethoscope and gave Carrison a firm nod. Soft tissue trauma, mild hypoxia, the physician said, his voice neutral but tight. No signs of lasting damage, but it was close. Carrison absorbed the words in silence. He placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. The boy had barely spoken since they'd landed, his eyes flickering between exhaustion and disbelief. But when his father's hand made contact, something in his breathing eased. Outside the room, federal officers were already moving down the passenger list. Each traveler was approached individually, but what investigators hadn't anticipated was unity. One by one, the passengers offered nearly identical stories, not in rehearsed precision, but in moral alignment. A teenage boy had been restrained before the flight even took off. No warning. No agression, no justification. They spoke not just of what they saw, but of what they now understood. Taryn Hale sat in the briefing room, his phone plugged into a secure terminal. The screen displayed thumbnails of the video he'd recorded, the moment Braden Torque shoved Jalen into the lavatory wall, the unnatural torque of the boy's arms, the faint but audible cry. I forwarded the clip to a secure aviation integrity server before I even handed over the phone, Taryn said to the officer interviewing him. That way no one could delete or tamper with it. His voice held steady, but his fingers trembled in his lap. Not from fear, but from the weight of doing what was right in a system that often punished courage. Varick Donnell followed next. The older flight attendant sat straight-backed, palms flat on the table. I saw the restraint, he admitted. I didn't stop it. I was afraid, but I won't lie to cover it. His words landed like quiet thunder. In another room, a terminal supervisor cross-checked Braden's employee record against an internal incident database. A faint chime sounded as the system retrieved multiple prior complaints, 3 in total. Allegations of excessive force, discriminatory language, procedural overreach. None had advanced beyond informal warnings. Until now, The presence of Kerrison Vale as the lead complainant had shifted the weight of every interaction. With witnesses, recordings, and a nationally recognized executive pressing for transparency, the old shield of silence no longer held. A twist that no one had seen coming, Braden's past, buried beneath bureaucratic fog, was now exposed under floodlights. In the same corridor, Kerrison spoke quietly with an aviation board director who had just arrived from the summit. The man, tall, silver-haired, with the posture of someone unaccustomed to turbulence, listened carefully as Kerrison described not just the abuse of his son, but the structural cracks that allowed it. The current misconduct reporting protocol, Kerrison said, tone precise, gives officers too much discretion. No oversight, no real-time counterbalance. My son's safety should never have been determined by one man's bias. The director exhaled slowly, then offered a grim nod. This incident, it may be the wedge that breaks the wall. I'll take this to the Oversight Committee immediately. Kerrison didn't thank him, not out of rudeness, but because this wasn't a favor. It was overdue justice. Back in the medical room, Jalen looked up as the door creaked open. A federal officer entered, flanked by 2 airport enforcers. But this time, they were not there for him. They approached Kerrison first. Mr. Vale, the officer said, Braden Torque has been taken into custody. He will be processed under both aviation conduct violations and federal assault parameters. We'd like to move forward with your statement. Kerrison nodded and turned to his son. You'll be okay here for a few minutes? Jalen met his gaze. Yeah, he whispered. I think so. Kerrison followed the agents out, his steps deliberate, controlled. Behind him, the monitor continued its steady rhythm. Later, through the glass of a side window, Jalen saw Braden being led away in cuffs, flanked by 2 officers, his eyes hollow and his jaw clenched. There was no shouting, no defiance, just silence, the kind that comes when power vanishes and only consequence remains. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply watched, unmoving, not out of satisfaction, but because justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it stood quietly with open eyes and a bruised wrist. And sometimes closure looked exactly like this. And for the first time since boarding the flight, Jalen felt the world tilt back toward fairness. The conference hall erupted in applause when Dr. Kerrison Vale stepped onto the stage, but the applause was not for what they thought. The projection behind him still read, forecasting future architectures in quantum-integrated systems. But Kerrison didn't even glance at it. He adjusted the mic clipped to his lapel, looked out at the sea of executives, regulators, and policy heads seated before him, and said calmly, I won't be speaking about systems today. I'll be speaking about silence, the kind that endangers lives. The room fell completely still. Just hours earlier, this same crowd had been preparing for a keynote on predictive architecture. None of them expected to witness a father exposing a systemic failure that now had its own flight number burned into federal logs. Meridian Sky, Flight 902. Cameras rolled. Phones lifted silently. The footage would travel farther than any algorithmic forecast ever could. Kerrison did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he told them what happened. How his son, Jalen Vale, was handcuffed without legal cause, suffocated into unconsciousness, and painted as a threat by an officer who believed he could get away with it. He played the footage, Taryn's clip, the lavatory camera footage, the moment Jalen gasped, I can't breathe. Men in the audience visibly recoiled. Several scribbled notes, others looked pale. Dramatic irony sharpened the edges of every moment. Those expecting innovation heard confession. Those trained in strategy were now called to face morality. Kerrison paused only once, to sip water, his hand steady, his voice unwavering. This wasn't just about a rogue officer. This was about a culture of unquestioned authority, he said, scanning the rows of suits. A system where protocol becomes a shield for abuse, and restraint becomes punishment instead of protection. If it can happen to a CEO's son, imagine who else it's happened to, silently, without a father able to intervene. A hush settled over the room. broken only by the occasional cough or shifting of expensive shoes on carpet. Harrison continued, outlining the timeline, naming the players, pointing to the gaps in the crew's oversight, and showing how existing aviation policies lacked clear safeguards for minors. Then, as if handing them their next step, he revealed a draft proposal. The Vail Passenger Protection Accord, he said, tapping the screen behind him, would ensure no minor is restrained mid-flight unless they present a verifiable, life-threatening danger. Anything less is not policy, it's cowardice. He stepped down from the podium to a standing ovation, not of celebration, but of reckoning. Back in the press wing, journalists scrambled to file urgent stories. Within hours, every major outlet had published headlines ranging from CEO interrupts aviation summit with explosive abuse claim to the Vail Accord, how one flight sparked industry-wide reform. By morning, at least 4 airlines publicly announced internal reviews of their restraint policies. 2 halted handcuff use entirely pending investigation. At a federal roundtable held 3 days later, Harrison was invited to serve as an executive co-author of the new guideline. The Aviation Conduct Board, previously a bureaucratic echo chamber, now found itself forced into action. The Vail Passenger Protection Accord passed the preliminary vote unanimously. Meanwhile, Jalen remained under supervised counseling provided by the airline's restitution division. Though physically healing, his emotional recovery came in quieter ways. Nights spent quietly sketching, walks with Harrison by the river near their estate, conversations that paused more often than they flowed. But Harrison never pushed. He simply remained beside him, offering presence over pressure, silence over speeches. Taryn Hale, the junior flight attendant who risked everything to show the truth, was honored during a private commendation hosted by the Aviation Ethics Initiative. He declined press interviews, choosing instead to enroll in a specialized training program focused on ethical crisis response. His supervisor, Varick Donnell, was promoted into the same program, citing his eventual honesty during the inquiry as a turning point. As for Officer Braden Tork, the fall was swift and sharp. He was formally charged with endangering a minor, falsifying an incident report, and abusing restraint protocols. Investigators reopened prior complaints filed against him, complaints that had been quietly shelved for insufficient corroboration. Now, with hard evidence and a national spotlight, those old files screamed louder than ever. Braden's badge was revoked. His name became a symbol in every new ethics training slideshow, not of power, but of its misuse. Foreshadowing of deeper change emerged when the Aviation Board's director publicly admitted that misconduct procedures lacked transparency. A full audit of crew disciplinary records was launched. Harrison, now a central figure in the reform, was asked to consult on transparency standards for passenger rights moving forward. And Jalen began to rebuild. At first, in hesitant steps, he volunteered quietly at a youth tech camp in the city, helping other teens learn code. He never mentioned what happened unless asked, and even then, only said, "We fixed it." But Harrison could see it in his posture, less defensive now, more grounded. In time, the incident became not just a memory, but a signal flare for reform. New signage appeared in airports, discreet but clear. All restraint uses on minors are logged, reviewed, and reported under Federal Guideline 4C. VPP 01. The skies would never operate the same again. And as the skies changed, so did the path forward for every father and son who would fly after them. Seconds later, the CEO arrived, the teen was freed, and the crew realized they had underestimated a man who commands both precision and authority. The handcuffs became the symbol of their misjudgment. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with preparation and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, racism, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on appearances. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on justice, accountability, and the importance of standing up against injustice.